Hey everyone, and welcome. The economic impact of immigration. Wow, it's a topic that sparks a ton of debate, right? But what does the data actually say? In this explainer, we're going to push all the opinions to the side, look directly at the research, and try to uncover some of the fiscal realities. Let's jump right in. So, let's get right to the big question. Are immigrants a net cost or a net benefit to a country's public finances? Now, you probably want a simple yes or no, but the truth is, the research shows a much more nuanced picture. The real answer? Well, it kind of depends on a whole bunch of different factors, which we are about to unpack.
Okay, first things first, we need to get our heads around a key concept, net fiscal contribution. You can basically think of it like a personal balance sheet with the government. On one side, you have all the taxes a person pays in. On the other side, you have the value of all the public services they use. Healthcare, education, social benefits, that kind of thing. The difference between those two is the net fiscal contribution. Simple as that.
So here's our game plan for today. We'll start with the basic fiscal balancing act. Then we'll get into the whole skills versus market needs debate. We'll touch on what the data says about the origin factor, look at a snapshot of European data, explore the huge difference between a single year and a lifetime view, and wrap it all up with the big policy question. All right, let's kick things off with Section 1, the Fiscal Balancing Act. This is where we break down the nuts and bolts of that net fiscal contribution we just talked about. So it really works like a pretty straightforward ledger. On the plus side, the contribution side, you've got tax revenue, which is especially high when immigrants land well-paid jobs. And on the cost side, you have all the government spending, things like social welfare, healthcare, education for kids, and eventually retirement pensions. The balance between these two columns is what gives you the final fiscal impact.
Okay, on to Section 2, skills versus market needs. Now, it's really tempting to just assume that a more educated immigrant is automatically a bigger fiscal benefit. But as the research shows, it's not quite that simple.
This slide paints a perfect picture of what I mean. Imagine a country has a desperate shortage of nurses, but way too many engineers. Now, an immigrant engineer, even if they're brilliant, might really struggle to find a job that matches their skills. But an immigrant nurse? They can step right into a high-demand role, start working, and start paying significant taxes right away. It just goes to show you that how well your skills match the labor market is every bit as important as the qualifications themselves. All right, now for Section 3, the origin factor. This is where we dig into some of the statistical patterns that researchers have found related to where immigrants come from. Now, it's really important to be clear here. We are simply reporting on the data presented in the source, which analyzes economic integration across a variety of groups. The source actually points to several factors that can lead to these different economic outcomes. Things like having access to the right social networks to find a job, or whether a country even recognizes your foreign qualifications. It also includes experiences with discrimination and other cultural features that the study gets into. All these variables can create different patterns of income and employment for different immigrant groups. Now for the fun part, the data. Section 4, a European data snapshot. We're going to dive into some specific numbers from studies across several European countries, all cited in our source material. And our main case study here comes from Denmark, using data from back in 2014. It gives us a really detailed, fascinating look at the net fiscal contributions of different groups living there. Okay, take a look at this table. The data from 2014 shows a really stark contrast. First-generation immigrants from Western countries contributed on average a net positive of 3,500 euros. But in contrast, first-generation immigrants from non-Western countries had a net negative contribution of 2,000 euros. And just for context, you can see that natives also had a small negative contribution that year, but that gap between the two immigrant groups is pretty significant. Let's just pull out that one figure and let it sink in. Negative 2,000 euros. What that means is that, for that year, the average value of services used was 2,000 euros more than the taxes paid by a first-generation non-Western immigrant in Denmark. And, this pattern wasn't just a one-off thing in Denmark. The source material shows pretty similar findings all across Scandinavia. In Norway, the gap was even wider. Western immigrants contributed over 7,000 euros, while non-Western immigrants were a net cost of over 9,000. And studies in both Sweden and Finland pointed to the very same trend.
And this story doesn't stop in Scandinavia. In the UK, data showed that European immigrants were net positive. The ratio was over 1, meaning they paid more in taxes than they got in benefits. In contrast, the ratio for non-European immigrants was actually below that of natives. The source also notes similar findings for places like France and the Netherlands, which suggests this is a pretty broad European pattern. But hold on, because this is where the story gets even more interesting. Section 5, Across Time and Generations. You see, all the data we've looked at so far is just a snapshot from one single year. And the source argues that to really get the full picture, you have to look at someone's entire lifetime. A snapshot analysis can be a little misleading. It often catches immigrants when they're young, in their prime working years. It's before they retire and start drawing a pension, and it's before you see the full costs of educating their children all the way through the system. The lifetime view, though, that's the whole movie. Not just a single frame. It models a person's contributions and costs over their entire life. It includes their working years, their retirement, and all the public investment in their kids' education. It's just a much more complete and, frankly, more accurate way to look at it. So let's circle back to that Danish data, but this time, let's look at the lifetime estimates. Now, notice the change for the second-generation non-Western immigrants. That annual snapshot we saw earlier showed a big negative number, right? But their lifetime contribution improves dramatically to just negative 1,100 euros. This really suggests that the children of these immigrants are integrating much more successfully into the labor market. And this brings us to a direct quote from the source material, which I think just sums it up perfectly. It makes more sense to analyze immigrants' lifetime fiscal contributions rather than calculating the current fiscal balances. This perspective really is the key to a much deeper understanding of the whole issue. So, all of this data, all of this analysis, it leads us to our final section, the policy question. Now that we've looked at the numbers, what are the real-world implications? How do we go from data to actual discussion? So let's do a super quick recap of the key takeaways from the source. 1. Fiscal impact is just a balance of taxes paid versus services used. 2. How well an immigrant's skills fit the job market is just as vital as their qualifications. 3. The data consistently shows different fiscal patterns based on origin, especially across European countries with big welfare states. And 4, and this is a big one, you've got to use a lifetime perspective to get the full story. And that leaves us with this final thought to chew on. The research we've gone through suggests that the makeup of an immigrant population can have a pretty significant impact on the finances of a generous welfare state. So, the big question becomes, how can policymakers use this kind of evidence to design immigration systems that are both fiscally sustainable and fair? That's definitely something to think about. Thanks so much for joining us.